Your next presenter is Elizabeth Hill. Elizabeth is the USDA Pollinator Coordinator for the Office of the Chief Scientist. In this role, she promotes collaboration and communication across USDA agencies and the managed pollinator industry and relevant USDA grant recipients. Further, she strives to ensure that USDA initiatives support pollinator health goals by providing strategic direction for research and programmatic efforts. Prior federal experience includes serving USDA's Office of Pest Management Policy and the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Pesticide Programs. Ms. Hill has worked as an agricultural extension agent with the University of Maryland on agriculture and beekeeping programs. Here is Ms. Elizabeth Hill.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. My name is Izzy Hill. I am the USDA Honeybee and Pollinator Research Coordinator with the Office of the Chief Scientist. And I'm here to chat with you a bit about our 2021 pollinator priorities that we have just established and will be finalizing for public dissemination in the coming weeks. There we go, sorry. So just a quick disclaimer, any findings, views, or conclusions presented are those of myself and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. And just quickly for a bit of background, the reason that USDA began working on establishing research priorities is that we were mandated to do so in the 2018 Farm Bill. And including specific coordination requirements, which is primarily what my role is. We also have over 30 different research charges related to pollinators that we were tasked with making sure we're satisfied. So in doing that, what we did is we went across the 14 different offices at USDA that have some aspect of pollinators in their portfolios, and we began to work very closely together in trying to determine what those priorities are. And just, I know that not everyone at this particular meeting has a pollinator interest, but I do think that this will be of value to those even in other areas of study, because this is really a pilot program to look at how can USDA be focusing more on specific subject matter areas that are cross-cutting against across different offices, which I know, especially with questions related to ecosystem services and contributors to those, that is often the case. So, you know, as you're listening to this presentation, be thinking to yourself, you know, how can this model, you know, potentially apply in your own area? And just remember that the ultimate goal of this, in addition, of course, to satisfying the Farm Bill, is that we are trying to create a guide for researchers and also for policymakers to help them in knowing, you know, what the best next steps are to be more efficiently addressing research needs. And I'm just going to quickly walk through our priority setting process that we established for this particular initiative. It's a 4-step process. The first is that we did a deep dive into our research and programmatic efforts within USDA and also those funded by USDA. I was surprised to find that we had over 200 active research projects. So, you know, once you start to get into the weeds, you start to find all sorts of different interesting projects that are being conducted. After doing that, we went and established a subject matter expert review board. And this, for FACA reasons, had to be internal federal employees, but we ended up with over 65 different federal employees with pollinator expertise. We were able to glean from some of our sister agencies, for example, at EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, Smithsonian, et cetera. And come together and really think about what our research needs were. And we then took what we came up with as a group and presented it at what we called the State of the Science workshop. And so this was a workshop where we invited over 100 external stakeholders to garner their feedback on what we saw as priorities And then we finally came back together again as the federal subject matter experts to decide what we saw as the top priorities. And we are, again, finalizing our report on that. So you guys, probably it'll be helpful to know that in the pollinator world, if this isn't your area, that even though this is one subject matter area, of course, there are subgroups of interest. And so for us, we decided to go with 5 different subject matter areas. The first is status and trends, which is mostly for monitoring efforts, and then also for the social sciences world, so economics, and then also some of our survey work. And then we also have forage habitat and nutrition. There is a pest and pathogen subject matter area. Environmental stressors, which encompasses multiple stressors that are abiotic in nature. So for example, pesticides or climate impacts or migratory stress. And then finally, we looked at genetics and biology. And so for each of these 5 groups, these were separate meetings of experts. Each of them had 2 team leaders that were knowledgeable in these areas because again, no one knows everything about all things pollinators. So, you know, it was really all hands on deck sort of effort. And again, it was lovely to see the conversations across these subject matter areas. And so, as I mentioned, after we met with our outside stakeholders, we went through specific criteria for prioritization. I definitely spent quite a bit of time looking through the many ways that you can try and semi-quantitatively measure people's opinions and feedback. And we ended up sticking to a very simple model where we looked at the need, feasibility, and impact of a particular initiative. And so need could be characterized as the need for researchers. It could also be characterized as the need for some of our stakeholders, such as beekeepers. And for feasibility, because the cost of specific studies can vary immensely depending on, you know, especially the scale of it. If this is going to be a local study versus a national study, there's clearly other drivers as well. So we decided not to consider the cost in our prioritization, but rather we looked at feasibility in terms of whether we thought people could get the work done. For example, we knew that study protocols were out there that could support it, and that sort of thing. And then finally, for impact, again, we were looking at, you know, what was the breadth of possible impacts, both for our researchers or policymakers, or also for our stakeholders from a specific initiative. And again, we kept it very simple. We did a 5-point Likert scale with points associated with each answer. And so again, our federal groups for each of those 5 subject matter areas completed surveys to, on their own accord, determine if a priority was very high, high, medium, low, negligible, or they didn't know, we didn't consider it. And again, very high would receive a score of 5 points, and negligible would receive a score of 1 point. And this is just an example, not to overwhelm you all with numbers, but this is what was generated for each of our 5 groups. And we were able to rank our initiatives based on the different measures. One thing to note is that this priority process is not just intended for USDA. We'll also be sharing this with outside funders of pollinator research. And, you know, for example, although some of our internal funders, such as NIFA, are highly focused on impact, we know that some of our smaller funders may be more interested in feasibility. So they'll be receiving a copy of the individual average scores for each of these criteria, but we started our conversations around total average scores. And for anyone out there who is interested in doing a prioritization process, this was, I think, key to us being successful in coming up with top initiatives for each of our groups. All right, so into the meat of what I think you all are interested in, which is the actual priorities. And one thing before we get into the specific subject matter areas is that there are 4 overall priorities that were showing up again and again And again, I don't think this is going to be specific to pollinators, but it definitely was the case here, which is that there's a great need for national coordination for data management and infrastructure. We also need improved methodologies and models, especially those that are multivariate, geospatial, and longitudinal in nature. There's a huge need for improved communication and coordination. And finally, also the integration of economic considerations. One thing I noted in our meetings was the people would light up when we had economists, for example, in a room with some of our taxonomists. They had just typically not crossed paths with each other. And I think there's a lot to be gained from those interdisciplinary relationships. So I'll go somewhat quickly through this for time's sake, but for status and trends, and you'll see this elsewhere, is that we really need to understand the basics of biological decline. That is just key to making any progress and being correct in our research paths moving forward. Second, we need to understand contributors to changing beekeeper yields and income. Third, we need to explore the economics of when to supplement honeybees for crop pollination. And by that, I mean supplementing pollination with non-honeybee species. This is becoming a hot area of study, and we're starting to see that growers can really increase their yields by trying to work across different species for specific crops. And then fourth, improvement in technologies to support the collection and management of baseline pollinator population data. You may or may not know that we have species of bees alone in the United States, and of course there are some non-bee pollinators as well, and for most of them we don't have a good understanding of their populations, which can be, again, a huge roadblock in terms of making progress in that area. Second, for forage, habitat, and nutrition, again and again, our subgroup members were requesting that we really start to invest in better frameworks for optimal planting choices, especially in agricultural areas. And there's a lot of different caveats and variables that can go into that. Second, we really wanted to understand returns on investment from forage and habitat within agricultural landscapes, both for beekeepers and those that are managing pollinators, but also for growers. Third, a determination of regional and spatiotemporal gaps in forage, habitat, and nutrition. Of course, greatly vary depending on where you are in the country, but it can also vary throughout the year and for other, based on other factors as well. And then finally, a better understanding of life cycle nutritional needs. So for example, a pollinator that is just emerging may have different needs than later on in life, et cetera. Third, for environmental stressors, we want to support and further interagency stakeholder interactions and connections. This is especially important in the pesticide realm, where we need to make sure that if a researcher is intending to have their research be influential in the policy realm, that they are following protocols and practices that must be adhered to for a policymaker to account for those results. And so I can say for certain that we'll be hosting, for example, multiple training and different sorts of workshops to try and connect our researchers better with those policymakers. And improvement of BMPs and IPM strategies for reducing environmental stress on pollinators, which is huge. Of course, we do have BMPs and IPM strategies already in place, but there's always room for improvement. Third, again, there you'll see the need for this group as well, the improvement in multivariate, geospatial, and longitudinal studies. This is key for environmental stressors, especially, think about climate change, think about, changes in the need for pest management strategies. All of these things are complicated questions that need good models to support them. And then fourth, a better understanding of temperature and climate impacts on pollinators. Of course, you have to think about the physiological changes in flowers that pollinators depend on and how that might be changing. And although we, of course, have migratory honeybees in the United States, many species are quite local and are, unable to potentially unable to be following the changes with the flowers that they specifically depend on. All right, and finally, for pests and pathogens, yet again, there's this need for standardized, representative, nationwide sampling systems for pests and pathogens. We don't have a great one in place at the moment. And again, this basic need for pest and pathogen biology, getting back to the basics so that we're going on the right paths with our research choices. Third, an improvement in communication and coordination for emerging pests and pathogens. So for example, in the background of this picture is the Asian giant hornet, which you might have heard about because it was a bit of a poster child for 2020. And so we need to be able to quickly respond to, these sorts of pests that are incredibly harmful to honeybees. And then finally, the creation of new diagnostics, practices, and treatments for pests and pathogens. There's some really interesting cutting edge developments that are happening, especially in the diagnostics world. And so getting what we know we can do in the lab out into the hands of beekeepers, supporting that tech transfer is going to be key in helping to quickly address our pest and pathogen issues for honeybees and other pollinators. And there's a picture of the Asian giant hornet. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I forgot. There's one more, genetics, breeding, and biology. Just quickly for time's sake, again, we need, yet again, the evaluation and documentation reporting coordination for genetics and breeding. By the way, we include pollination biology in this group. We, of course, need to assess the effectiveness of breeding practices. There are still a lot of questions on how to do that best to prevent bottlenecks in our genetics. Third, we need to produce basic missing biological information. Yet again, these groups are separate, but you're seeing this, repeating need come up again and again. And then finally, to address our pollination contributions in different species. We pretty much understand honeybees, but again, as mentioned, there are contributions from other species that should also be accounted for. And finally, moving forward, to begin addressing this, our office is funding what we're calling the Pollinator 360 dashboard. This is a subject matter specific dashboard developed in Tableau, if you're familiar with that, where we are hoping to include information not only on research projects, but also on researchers and output that they're generating in the pollinator world, which will have both internal and external servers so that you can have different levels of admin rights for what can be viewed. But we're hoping this might be a good first step to addressing some of these national coordination issues that we're seeing. This is just a sample dashboard, but for example, we can get into mapping, we can start to get down to state level information, or whatever it is you want to look at in terms of slicing and dicing the data. This is a really nice tool, and I think a first step to addressing some of the priorities that we outlined today. So with that, thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, so feel free to shoot me an email if you would like to learn more. That's elizabeth.hill2@usda.gov, and thank you for your time.